banquet hall was already full of noise and light when Elena Voss stepped through the doors alone, and every voice in the room seemed to catch at once. Silver had been draped over every table, the pack crest hung high above the fireplace, and hundreds of pack members turned their heads toward her, as if a cold wind had blown in with her arrival. She had known this moment would come. She had rehearsed it in her mind 100 times on the long drive back into Ironwood territory. Nothing had prepared her for how it actually felt to stand in the doorway of the ceremony hall, watching the man who once rejected her raise a glass to his new mate. Callum Ashford stood at the center of the room in a fitted charcoal suit, his hand resting easily on the shoulder of a tall woman with dark curls and a triumphant smile. Priya Sinclair. Elena had heard the name whispered through the pack for months, always attached to words like golden, and perfect, and worthy. Words that had never once been used to describe her. Callum's eyes found Elena across the crowded room, and for a heartbeat something flickered there. Not guilt, not regret, only satisfaction. He had sent the invitation himself. He had signed it with his own hand, and mailed it to the small apartment 3 towns away, where Elena had rebuilt her quiet life. And he had done it because he wanted her to see this. He wanted her to stand in this room and watch him claim someone the pack considered worthy, while she remained the woman he had once called an embarrassment. 2 years earlier, in this very hall, Elena had stood beside Callum during the reveal ceremony that should have bound them as fated mates. She could still remember the exact moment the mark appeared on her wrist, glowing faintly blue in the candlelight, matching the one that bloomed on his arm at the same instant. She could still remember the way the room had gone silent, with anticipation, waiting for him to step forward and complete the bond in front of the pack elders. Instead, Callum had looked at her as though she were something unpleasant that had been placed in his path, and he had said the words that ended everything before it began. He had rejected her, right there, in front of everyone who mattered, because her family carried a name that had fallen out of favor with the pack council years before she was even born. It did not matter that Elena herself had done nothing to earn that shame. It only mattered that Callum saw an opportunity to distance himself from anything less than perfect, and he took it without hesitation. The rejection had marked her in ways that went far beyond the fading scar on her wrist. Packs did not forget when a fated bond was refused, and they did not forgive the person left standing alone, even though she had done nothing wrong. Her family, already fragile in status, pulled away from her within weeks, afraid that continued association would drag them further down. Old friends stopped answering her messages. She lost her position helping run the pack's small medical clinic, quietly replaced by someone with a cleaner reputation. By the time the leaves began to turn that first autumn, Elena understood that Ironwood no longer had a place for her, and she made the only choice that felt like her own. She left. Now she stood in the doorway of the same hall, older, steadier, and undeniably changed, watching Callum lift his glass in her direction, as though offering a toast meant only for her to understand. It was cruelty, dressed up as ceremony, and everyone in the room seemed to know it, even if none of them said so aloud. A few pack members glanced at her with something like pity. Others looked away entirely, unwilling to be caught watching the moment unfold. Priya's smile did not waver, though her eyes swept over Elena with obvious curiosity, as if trying to understand what kind of woman would be foolish enough to accept an invitation like this. Elena had asked herself the same question more than once, during the drive back into territory she had sworn never to return to. She could have thrown the invitation away. She could have ignored it completely, and let Callum wonder whether his cruelty had even reached her. But something in her, some quiet and stubborn part that refused to keep hiding, told her that walking away without ever facing this room again would leave a wound that never fully closed. She needed to stand here, just once, and prove to herself that she could. She had not expected to arrive with anyone beside her. She had planned to walk in alone, chin high, and leave the moment courtesy allowed. But 3 days earlier, on a stretch of quiet highway far from any pack she recognized, her plans had changed, in ways she never could have predicted. It had started with a breakdown. Her car had sputtered and died on an empty road just after sunset, the kind of isolated stretch where cell service flickered in and out, and no one passed for miles at a time. Elena had stepped out to check the engine, more out of frustration than any real hope of fixing it herself, when she heard movement in the tree line beyond the shoulder of the road. Rogue wolves were not common on well-traveled routes, but they were not unheard of either. and the way the shadows shifted told her this was not her imagination. Her pulse had quickened, every instinct urging her back toward the car, toward locked doors that would do little good against a determined wolf. She had been 3 steps from safety when a low growl rolled out from the darkness ahead of her, not behind, and she realized with a jolt of fear that she had misjudged the direction entirely. A shape emerged from the trees, low and fast, eyes catching what little light remained in the sky. Elena had frozen, every year of pack training rushing back into her mind at once, none of it useful against the sudden certainty that she was about to face something she could not outrun. Before the wolf could close the distance, another shape crashed into it from the side, a much larger form that moved with a controlled power Elena had rarely witnessed. The 2 wolves rolled once across the gravel shoulder, and then it was over almost as quickly as it began, the smaller wolf yelping and retreating into the trees, driven off by something it clearly recognized as far more dangerous than itself. Elena stood rooted in place, breath caught in her throat, as the larger wolf turned toward her, its massive frame silhouetted against the fading light. For a long moment neither of them moved. Then the wolf began to shift, bones and muscle rearranging, with the fluid speed of someone deeply practiced in controlling the change, until a man stood where the wolf had been, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed simply in dark clothing that gave no hint of who he might be. His eyes, though, held an unmistakable authority, a kind of calm command that Elena had only ever seen in pack leaders who had spent years learning to control every room they entered. He introduced himself only as Kale, offering no last name, no pack affiliation, nothing beyond a quiet assurance that the rogue would not return tonight. Elena, still shaking slightly from the encounter, gave her own name in return, grateful and wary in equal measure. Something about him made her want to trust him immediately, and something else made her cautious of exactly how easily that trust had come. Kale insisted on staying until her car could be looked at properly, and when it became clear the vehicle would not start again without a mechanic, he offered to see her safely to wherever she was headed, rather than leaving her stranded on an empty road as darkness settled fully around them. Elena hesitated only briefly before accepting. She had learned the hard way that pride could be a costly companion when survival was at stake, and there was something steady in the way Kale carried himself that made the offer feel less like charity and more like simple decency. As they waited for a tow to arrive, sitting on the hood of his own vehicle, beneath a sky just beginning to fill with stars, conversation drifted between them more easily than Elena expected. She found herself telling him, in careful and guarded pieces, that she was traveling back into a territory she had left behind, for an event she was not looking forward to. She did not tell him everything. She did not mention Callum by name, or the reveal ceremony, or the rejection that had reshaped the entire course of her life. But something in her voice must have carried the weight of it anyway, because Kale listened with a quiet attentiveness that made her feel, for the first time in a long while, that someone was actually paying attention to what she was not saying as much as what she was. By the time the tow truck arrived and hauled her car away for repairs that would take several days, Elena realized she had no easy way to continue her journey. Kale, without any hesitation that might have made the offer feel awkward, suggested she travel the rest of the way with him. He was heading in a similar direction, he explained, toward business of his own that he did not elaborate on, and it made little sense for her to wait alone for a bus that might not arrive until well past the day of the ceremony. Elena knew, even as she agreed, that this was not a decision she would have made 2 years earlier. The old version of herself, the one who still believed staying quiet and agreeable might earn her a place among people who had already decided she did not belong, would have insisted on managing everything alone, rather than risk becoming a burden to a stranger. But 2 years of rebuilding herself from nothing had taught her that survival sometimes meant accepting help exactly when it was offered, without apology and without unnecessary pride. The following morning, they set out together, the miles unwinding steadily beneath them, as the landscape shifted from open highway to the thick forested hills that marked the edges of Ironwood territory. Elena watched the familiar scenery approach with a tightening in her chest that had nothing to do with the man beside her, and everything to do with the memories waiting for her at the end of the road. Kale seemed to notice the change in her, the way her hands tightened slightly in her lap as recognizable landmarks began to appear. Though he said nothing to press her further, he simply drove, steady and unhurried, offering the kind of quiet presence that did not demand explanation, but somehow made the weight of the coming days feel a little more bearable. It was somewhere along that final stretch of road, watching the sun begin its slow descent behind the tree line, that Elena allowed herself to wonder, just briefly, what kind of man Cale truly was, beneath the calm exterior and the effortless authority he carried, without ever seeming to notice it himself. She did not yet know his last name. She did not know which pack claimed him, or what business waited for him in these hills. She only knew that something about his presence had already begun to settle the storm that had been building inside her since the moment she opened Callum's invitation, and that unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. Now, standing in the doorway of the ceremony hall 2 nights later, watching Callum raise his glass in mockery from across the room, Elena understood that whatever quiet comfort those 2 days on the road had given her was about to be tested in the cruelest way possible. She had come here to prove she could stand alone. She had not expected to feel, even for a moment, that she might not have to. Priya leaned close to Callum, whispering something Elena could not hear, and Callum's smile widened into something sharper, something that made the room feel colder, despite the warmth of the fireplace and the crowd. He set down his glass and began walking toward her with the unhurried confidence of a man who believed he had already won whatever contest he imagined was taking place between them. Elena felt her pulse quicken, felt the old instinct to shrink back rising in her chest, and she forced herself to breathe, to remember every mile of road that had brought her to this exact moment, and to stand exactly where she was. She did not yet know that outside, in the cool evening air, beyond the hall's tall windows, a car had just pulled into the courtyard, its arrival drawing the attention of pack guards, who straightened instantly at the sight of the insignia on its door. She did not yet know that the man who had saved her life on a dark and empty road was about to walk through those same doors behind her, and that his presence would change everything she thought she understood about the night ahead. Callum crossed the last few steps between them, with the easy stride of a man who had never once doubted himself, and the hall seemed to hold its breath around them both. Elena kept her chin level, her hands loose at her sides, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. Up close, he looked exactly as she remembered, sharp-featured and carefully groomed, though there was a new hardness around his eyes that had not been there 2 years earlier, as though ambition had slowly worn away whatever softness might once have lived beneath his confidence. "I wondered if you would actually come," he said, pitching his voice just loud enough for the nearest cluster of guests to hear without seeming to try. "I half expected you to hide away in whatever little town you crawled off to." Elena held his gaze steadily. "You sent the invitation. I assumed you wanted me here." Something flickered across his face, a brief surprise at her composure, quickly smoothed back into practiced arrogance. "I wanted you to see what you gave up," he said, glancing back toward Priya, who watched the exchange with an expression that mixed curiosity and faint amusement, as though observing a performance staged entirely for her benefit. "She understands what it means to build something worthy of this pack. Something you never could." The words were meant to cut, and once, not so long ago, they might have. Elena felt the old sting rise briefly in her chest, the familiar ache of being told she was not enough, but beneath it, steadier now, she felt something else entirely. She felt tired of it. Tired of standing in rooms built by people who measured worth through bloodlines and reputations rather than character. Tired of letting a single moment 2 years old continue to define every conversation she had with this man. "You didn't reject me because I wasn't worthy, Callum," she said quietly, her voice carrying just enough to reach the small crowd now openly listening. "You rejected me because my family's name made you nervous about your own reputation. That was never about me. It was about what you were afraid people might think of you." A ripple of murmurs passed through the nearby guests, quickly hushed as Callum's expression darkened. He opened his mouth to respond, some sharp retort clearly forming, when the heavy doors at the far end of the hall swung open with a force that drew every eye in the room away from the pair of them entirely. The temperature in the hall seemed to shift the instant Cale stepped through the entrance. He had changed from the simple travel clothes Elena had grown used to over the past 2 days, into something far more formal, dark, and precisely tailored, in a way that spoke of resources few in this room could imagine. But it was not his clothing that silenced the crowd. It was the way the pack guards stationed near the doors immediately dropped their eyes and stepped aside, the way conversation died in overlapping waves as recognition spread outward from those closest to the entrance, the way even Priya's confident posture faltered slightly as something like disbelief crossed her features. Elena turned, and for a moment forgot entirely about Callum standing beside her. Cale's eyes found hers across the room, and held there, steady and certain, before he began walking toward her, with the same unhurried authority she remembered from the road, except now that authority seemed to fill the entire hall. "You're late," she said quietly, when he reached her side, surprised by how normal the words felt leaving her mouth, as though they had done this 100 times before, rather than only having known each other for 2 days. "Traffic," Cale replied, the faintest trace of amusement in his voice, though his eyes moved briefly and deliberately toward Callum, taking his measure in a single unhurried glance that made the other man visibly straighten under the scrutiny. Callum recovered his composure with visible effort, forcing a tight smile onto his face as he extended a hand toward the newcomer. "I don't believe we've met," he said. "Callum Ashford. This is my mating ceremony, and you are—" "Cale Draven," came the reply, calm and unhurried, offered without any particular emphasis, as though the name alone should not have mattered. But it did matter, immediately and unmistakably, spreading through the nearest guests like a spark catching dry grass. Whispers rose and multiplied, spreading outward toward every corner of the hall within seconds, and Elena watched Callum's face shift through several expressions in rapid succession, confusion giving way to dawning recognition, recognition giving way to something close to alarm. The name meant nothing to Elena in that moment, not fully, though she understood from the reaction rippling through the room that it carried enormous weight among those gathered here. She glanced sideways at Cale, questions forming that she had no opportunity to ask, before Callum spoke again, his voice noticeably less steady than it had been moments earlier. "The Alpha King," Callum said, the words coming out almost as a whisper, before he seemed to catch himself and repeat them louder, as though needing the room to confirm he had not misheard. "You're the Alpha King of the Northern Coalition." A murmur of confirmation swept through the crowd, and Elena felt the ground shift beneath her understanding of the past 2 days entirely. The steady, unassuming man who had pulled a rogue wolf off her on a dark and empty road, who had shared quiet conversation with her beneath a sky full of stars, who had driven her the rest of the way into territory neither of them had discussed in any detail, was one of the most powerful figures in the entire region, a leader whose authority extended across territories that dwarfed Ironwood many times over. Cale did not confirm or deny the title directly, offering only a faint incline of his head that somehow felt like answer enough. His attention returned fully to Callum, and something in his expression cooled considerably. The easy calm Elena had grown familiar with replaced by something far more measured and precise. "I understand congratulations are in order," Cale said, his tone giving nothing away, though Elena noticed the way his gaze flicked briefly toward her, before returning to Callum. "A mating ceremony is not a small thing. It deserves to be treated with appropriate respect." The words carried a weight that seemed to land squarely on Callum's shoulders, and Elena watched understanding dawn slowly across his features, the realization that whatever game he believed himself to be playing tonight had shifted into territory he had never anticipated. Priya stepped closer to Callum's side, her earlier confidence replaced by visible unease, as she studied Cale, with the wary attention of someone recalculating every assumption she had walked into this room believing. "I wasn't aware you and Elena were acquainted," Callum said carefully, clearly fishing for information he desperately needed and did not yet have. "We met a few days ago," Cale replied simply, offering no further detail, though the lack of explanation seemed somehow more unsettling to Callum than any elaborate story might have been. "Circumstances brought us together on the road. I found the company worth continuing." Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, though she kept her expression carefully neutral, unwilling to give either man the satisfaction of watching her react too visibly to anything happening in this moment. She was acutely aware of every eye in the hall fixed on the three of them now, the entire ceremony effectively suspended as guests abandoned pretense of polite conversation to watch this new development unfold in real time. Callum's jaw tightened, and Elena could see him searching for some way to reclaim control of the narrative he had so carefully constructed for tonight, some way to spin this unexpected arrival back into the humiliation he had planned for her. But every angle seemed to close before he could reach it, and the growing silence around them, only made his uncertainty more visible to the crowd watching closely. "Well," Callum finally managed, forcing his voice back into something resembling confidence. "I suppose it's fortunate Elena found someone willing to escort her tonight. It can't be easy, attending alone, after everything." The attempt at cruelty landed with far less force than he clearly intended, mostly because the room's attention had shifted so completely away from Elena's supposed shame and onto the far more pressing question of why the Alpha King of the Northern Coalition had chosen to walk into a minor pack's mating ceremony beside a woman most of them had written off as inconsequential 2 years earlier. Cale's expression did not change, but something in his voice sharpened almost imperceptibly. "I don't consider tonight's company unfortunate," he said. "Quite the opposite." Elena felt the words settle over her like warmth spreading slowly through cold hands, and for the first time since stepping through the hall's doors, she allowed herself the smallest hint of a genuine smile. Whatever Callum had planned for this evening, whatever careful cruelty he had constructed to remind her of everything he believed she had lost, none of it had accounted for the possibility that the stranger who saved her on an empty road might turn out to be someone with the power to unravel his entire performance in a matter of minutes. Across the hall, near the long table draped in white linen and silver candles, meant to honor the coming ceremony, the pack elders had begun exchanging glances of their own, quiet conversation passing between them, that Elena could not hear, but could clearly sense the weight of. Something had shifted in the room tonight, beyond the simple discomfort of an unexpected guest. Something far larger was beginning to take shape, and Elena understood, with a growing certainty that settled deep in her chest, that the story she had walked into this hall believing would end in quiet humiliation was only just beginning to reveal how much more complicated the night ahead would truly become. The pack elders did not waste time debating quietly among themselves once the shock of Cale's arrival began to settle. Elena watched as an older woman with silver-streaked hair and sharp, appraising eyes rose from the elders' table and approached with the measured steps of someone who had spent decades navigating delicate pack politics. This was Margaret Ellery, Elena remembered, the most senior elder of Ironwood, a woman known throughout the territory for her unwavering commitment to tradition and her equally unwavering distrust of anything that threatened the pack's careful order. "Alpha King," Margaret said, inclining her head with the precise depth of respect required by protocol, though her eyes carried unmistakable curiosity as they moved between Cale and Elena. "We are honored, if somewhat surprised, by your presence tonight. May I ask what brings the leader of the Northern Coalition to a ceremony as modest as this one?" Cale's response came without hesitation, his voice carrying easily across the now silent hall. "I came because someone important to me needed to attend an event she was not looking forward to facing alone," he said simply. "I did not realize until we arrived that the details of tonight's ceremony carried additional weight worth addressing directly." Margaret's gaze sharpened, understanding beginning to dawn as she glanced toward Elena, then toward Callum, whose earlier confidence had thinned considerably under the combined scrutiny of the elder and the king. "You are referring to the rejection," Margaret said carefully, choosing her words with the precision of someone who understood exactly how sensitive this particular history remained within the pack. "I am referring to the fact that Elena Voss carried a faded mark that was refused publicly, in this very hall, by the man now celebrating his own mating ceremony," Cale said, his voice remaining level, but carrying an edge that made several nearby guests shift uncomfortably where they stood. "I understand pack customs vary, but in the territories I oversee, a rejected mate is not treated as an object of ridicule to be paraded before for entertainment. She is treated with the respect owed to anyone who survived a broken bond through no fault of her own." A wave of murmurs spread through the crowd, and Elena felt her chest tighten with an unfamiliar mixture of embarrassment and something closer to vindication. She had spent 2 years believing that what happened to her in this hall was simply the natural order of things, a truth so deeply embedded in pack custom that questioning it had never even occurred to her. Hearing Cale name it so plainly, so publicly, as a wrong rather than an inevitability, cracked something open inside her that she had not realized she was still holding closed. Callum stepped forward, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "With respect, Alpha King, what happened between Elena and myself 2 years ago is a private matter between our families. I fail to see how it concerns the leadership of another territory entirely." Cale turned toward him slowly, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop another degree. "It concerns me," he said, "because the woman you rejected and then invited here, specifically to witness your triumph, is someone I intend to know a great deal better in the coming months. Whatever history exists between the two of you, I would prefer to understand it clearly, before deciding how much patience this pact deserves from me going forward." The implication landed heavily across the hall, and Elena watched understanding ripple outward through the gathered guests, as quickly as it had when Cale's name was first spoken aloud. This was no longer simply an awkward social collision between a rejected mate and the man who had humiliated her. This was now, unmistakably, a matter that touched the delicate balance of power between Ironwood and one of the most influential territories in the region, and every person in the hall seemed to grasp the stakes at nearly the same moment. Priya, who had remained mostly silent since Cale's arrival, finally stepped forward, her voice carrying a note of desperation beneath its practiced smoothness. "Alpha King, I assure you, nothing that happened tonight was meant with any disrespect toward you or your territory. Callum simply wanted closure with someone from his past. Surely that is understandable." "Closure," Cale repeated, letting the word hang in the air with obvious skepticism. "Is that what tonight was meant to be? Because from where I was standing, it looked considerably more like a public performance designed to remind a woman of a humiliation she never deserved in the first place, staged specifically for an audience gathered to celebrate someone else entirely." No one in the hall offered a response to that. Even Margaret, whose loyalty to pack tradition ran deep, appeared unwilling to defend the framing Priya had offered, her expression suggesting she had already reached similar conclusions on her own. Elena felt Cale's hand settle lightly at the small of her back, a gesture so natural it seemed to have happened without conscious thought on his part, though it steadied her more than she expected. She glanced up at him, searching his face for some sign of performance, some indication that this was simply a display of power meant to establish dominance in a room full of strangers. She found none. What she found instead was quiet, focused attention, entirely directed toward her, as though the rest of the hall had faded into background noise the moment his hand touched her back. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly, pitching her voice low enough that only he could hear it clearly over the murmuring crowd. "I came here to prove I could face this on my own." Cale's eyes softened slightly, though his expression remained otherwise composed for the benefit of the watching room. "You have already proven that," he said, matching her quiet tone. "You stood in that doorway and let him see exactly how little power his words still held over you. Nothing I say tonight changes what you already accomplished simply by walking in here." Something warm settled in Elena's chest at the words, a feeling she had not allowed herself in longer than she cared to admit, and she found herself, for just a moment, forgetting entirely about the hundreds of eyes still fixed on them both. Callum, watching the exchange with visibly mounting frustration, seemed to reach some internal breaking point. "This is absurd," he said, his voice rising enough to draw every eye back toward him. "You met her what, 3 days ago? On some empty road, apparently, and now you're standing here lecturing an entire pack about how she deserves to be treated, as though you understand the first thing about our history together." "I understand enough," Cale replied evenly. "I understand that a fated mark connected the two of you, and that you looked at it as an inconvenience rather than a gift. I understand that instead of simply declining the bond privately, with whatever dignity such a difficult decision required, you chose to humiliate her publicly, in front of everyone she had ever known. And I understand that 2 years later, rather than allowing her the peace of moving forward without further intrusion, you invited her back specifically to relive that humiliation for your own satisfaction." Callum's face reddened, and for a moment, Elena thought he might attempt some further defense. But the weight of the silent hall around him seemed to finally register, dozens of pack members watching with expressions that had shifted noticeably from curiosity to something closer to quiet judgment. Whatever story he had told himself about tonight, about reclaiming power over a woman who had once represented everything he wanted to distance himself from, had unraveled far more completely than he could have anticipated. Margaret cleared her throat, stepping into the tense silence with the practiced authority of someone accustomed to smoothing over difficult moments before they escalated further. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "it would be best to allow tonight's ceremony to proceed as planned and address the matter of past grievances at another time, in a more private setting." Cale inclined his head toward her, the gesture polite but leaving little room for argument. "That seems reasonable," he said. "Elena and I have no wish to disrupt a ceremony that has nothing to do with either of us, beyond the unfortunate history already discussed. We came tonight because she deserved to walk into this hall with her head held high, and I believe that has been accomplished." He turned to Elena, offering his arm with a small, questioning tilt of his head that left the choice entirely hers. She hesitated only a moment before accepting, sliding her hand into the crook of his elbow with a steadiness that surprised even herself. Together they moved away from Callum and Priya, toward a quieter corner of the hall where the elders had arranged refreshments for guests not directly involved in the ceremony's formal proceedings, leaving behind a silence that no one in the crowd seemed eager to break first. As they walked, Elena felt the weight of dozens of gazes following them, no longer filled with the pity or quiet judgment she had expected upon arrival, but something closer to fascination, even respect. She had come into this hall bracing herself for humiliation, and instead found herself walking out of the worst of it beside a man whose mere presence had rewritten the entire narrative Callum had spent months constructing. "Thank you," she said quietly. Once they had put enough distance between themselves and the center of the hall, that conversation felt private again. "For what you said back there. I don't think anyone has ever put it in those terms before. Not even me." Cale glanced down at her, something unreadable passing behind his eyes before he answered. "You deserve to hear it," he said simply. "Sometimes the truth needs someone else to say it out loud before it becomes real enough to believe." Elena considered his words carefully, turning them over in her mind, as the ceremony behind them slowly resumed its interrupted rhythm. Musicians picking up a melody that had stalled during the confrontation. Guests returning to hushed conversation that no longer centered entirely on her. She glanced toward Callum one final time, watching him force a smile back onto his face for Priya's benefit, though the confidence that had carried him through the earlier confrontation seemed permanently diminished. For the first time in 2 years, standing in the very hall where her worst humiliation had taken place, Elena did not feel small. She felt, for reasons she was only beginning to understand, that the story she believed had ended that night 2 years ago was only now truly beginning, and that whatever came next would be written entirely on her own terms. The rest of the ceremony passed in a strange blur for Elena, the formal exchange of vows between Callum and Priya conducted beneath the watchful gaze of the pack elders, while she stood near the back of the hall beside Cale, close enough to observe every detail, yet distant enough that none of it seemed to touch her the way it once might have. She watched Callum recite words that had been denied to her, watched the mark bloom on Priya's wrist to match his, and felt, to her genuine surprise, nothing more than a quiet, settled indifference where she had once feared only pain would live. When the ceremony finally concluded and guests began drifting toward tables laden with food and drink, Cale suggested they step outside for air, away from the crowded warmth of the hall and the lingering attention that still followed them both. Elena agreed readily, grateful for the chance to breathe without dozens of eyes tracking her every movement. The courtyard beyond the hall's tall doors was quiet and cool, lit only by strings of soft lantern light woven through the branches of old oak trees that had stood on this land longer than the pack itself. Elena walked beside Cale, in comfortable silence for a while, the tension of the evening slowly draining from her shoulders, as the noise of the celebration faded behind them. "I owe you an explanation," Cale said eventually, breaking the quiet as they reached a stone bench positioned beneath the largest of the oaks. "About who I am, and why I didn't mention it sooner." Elena settled onto the bench, studying him carefully in the dim light. "I assumed you had your reasons." "I did," he admitted, sitting beside her, close but not touching. "When I travel outside my own territory, I rarely announce myself immediately. People behave differently around power, Elena. They calculate, they perform, they tell you what they think you want to hear, rather than what they actually believe. On that road, when your car broke down, I wanted to help because it seemed like the right thing to do, not because I was thinking about titles or territories or anything beyond making sure you got where you needed to go safely." "And the 2 days after that?" she asked, genuinely curious. "You could have told me at any point during the drive here. Instead, I found out the same moment the entire pack did." Cale was quiet for a moment, considering his answer carefully. "Honestly, I kept waiting for the right opportunity, and then I kept finding reasons to let the conversation stay simple instead," he admitted. "I enjoyed talking with you without the weight of my position sitting between us. It's rare in my life to have a conversation that isn't shaped by what someone wants from me or expects of me. I wasn't ready to give that up yet. Elena turned his words over, understanding the sentiment more than she expected to. She had spent 2 years being defined by a single moment of rejection, watched by everyone around her through the lens of what had happened, rather than who she actually was. The idea that someone as powerful as Cale might crave the opposite, a chance to simply exist without the constant weight of expectation, resonated with her more deeply than she anticipated. "I'm not upset," she said finally. "Surprised, maybe, but not upset. Though I should probably ask what exactly you meant back there, in front of the entire pack, about wanting to know me better in the coming months." A faint smile touched Cale's mouth, the first genuine one she had seen from him since they arrived. "I meant exactly what I said. Whatever this is between us, Elena, I don't think either of us can pretend it started on that road by accident. I've led my territory for 6 years without ever encountering someone who made ordinary conversation feel like the most interesting part of my day. I'm not interested in walking away from that simply because tonight's circumstances turned out to be more complicated than either of us expected." Elena felt her pulse quicken, a mixture of hope and caution warring inside her chest. She had spent 2 years building walls carefully around herself, protecting whatever remained of her confidence from the possibility of another rejection as devastating as the first. The idea of lowering those walls again, especially for someone whose position carried stakes far beyond anything she had previously navigated, frightened her more than she wanted to admit. "I need you to understand something," she said carefully. "I'm not looking for someone to rescue me from my past. What happened tonight, what happened 2 years ago, none of that needs fixing by anyone else. I've already done the work of rebuilding myself, without expecting anyone to hand me back the confidence Callum tried to take away." Cale nodded slowly, something like respect passing across his expression. "I never assumed otherwise," he said. "I didn't step into that hall tonight to rescue you, Elena. You didn't need rescuing. You needed someone willing to stand beside you while you did what you had already decided to do on your own. There's a difference, and I think you already know that." The distinction settled over her gently, easing some of the tension she had been carrying since the moment he offered his arm inside the hall. She studied him in the soft lantern light, searching for any trace of the calculation she had learned to expect from people who wanted something from her, and found instead only quiet sincerity that matched the steady presence she had come to trust over the past 3 days. "What happens now?" she asked, the question carrying weight beyond the immediate moment, extending toward the uncertain territory of everything that had shifted since Cale walked through those hall doors. "That depends largely on what you want," he replied. "I have no intention of pretending tonight didn't happen, or pretending that what I said in front of your pack wasn't entirely genuine, but I also have no intention of pushing you toward anything faster than you're ready for. You've spent 2 years reclaiming your own life on your own terms. I'm not interested in undoing that work by making decisions for you now." Elena appreciated the honesty more than she could easily express, the careful respect he extended toward her autonomy, even as the pull between them grew increasingly difficult to ignore. She thought back over the past 3 days, the quiet conversations on the road, the steady comfort of his presence beside her, in a room designed to make her feel small, and understood with growing certainty that whatever this connection was, it deserved more than dismissal, simply because it had arrived faster and more powerfully than she expected. "I'd like to see where this goes," she said finally, the words feeling both terrifying and freeing as she spoke them aloud. "Slowly, on terms that work for both of us, but I'd like to see where it goes." Cale's expression softened into something warmer than she had yet seen from him, and he reached over, taking her hand gently in his, the gesture careful and unhurried. "I can work with slowly," he said. "I've waited 6 years to find someone worth waiting for. A little more patience seems like a reasonable price." They sat together beneath the old oak tree for a while longer, the celebration continuing distantly behind them, neither in any particular hurry to return to the crowded hall, or the curious eyes that would inevitably follow their reappearance. Elena felt something settle inside her that had been unsteady for longer than she cared to admit, a sense of ground beneath her feet that felt more solid than anything she had experienced since the night her fated mark first appeared, and then was so publicly discarded. Eventually, as the evening air grew cooler and the sounds of celebration began to quiet, Kale suggested they head back toward the hall to make their farewells, before the night grew too late. Elena agreed, though as they rose from the bench and began walking back toward the warm light spilling from the tall windows ahead, she found herself glancing back once at the quiet courtyard, marking the spot where everything between them had shifted from cautious possibility into something that felt, for the first time, like it might actually be real. Neither of them noticed, as they walked back toward the hall, the figure watching from a shadowed doorway near the edge of the courtyard, arms crossed tightly, expression unreadable in the dim light. Margaret Ellery had stepped outside for air of her own, and had witnessed far more of the conversation between Elena and the Alpha King than either of them realized, her sharp mind already turning over the implications of what she had just seen and heard, implications that extended far beyond the simple drama of a rejected mate and her former betrothed, into questions of alliance and power that would soon reach every corner of Ironwood territory, whether Elena and Kale were ready for that attention or not. Margaret Ellery did not immediately reveal what she had witnessed in the courtyard, choosing instead to return to the hall and observe the remainder of the evening, with the same careful attention she had spent decades honing as senior elder of Ironwood. She watched Elena and Kale re-enter the celebration, watched the way heads turned to track their movement, watched Callum's forced smile falter each time his gaze drifted toward the pair standing quietly near the refreshment tables. By the time the last guests began filtering out into the night, Margaret had already decided that tomorrow would require a conversation neither Elena nor the Pack Council could afford to delay. That conversation came sooner than expected. Elena had barely settled into the small guest room the Pack had reluctantly provided her for the night, still turning over the events of the evening in her mind, when a soft knock sounded at her door. She opened it to find Margaret standing in the hallway, her expression composed but carrying an intensity that made Elena's stomach tighten with immediate wariness. "I won't take much of your time," Margaret said, stepping inside once Elena gestured her in. "But I think you and I need to speak plainly about what happened tonight, and what it might mean going forward." Elena gestured toward the room's single chair, taking a seat herself on the edge of the narrow bed. "I'm listening." Margaret settled into the chair with the deliberate care of someone whose joints had grown less forgiving with age, folding her hands neatly in her lap before continuing. "I saw you and the Alpha King in the courtyard tonight," she said, watching carefully for Elena's reaction. "I heard enough of your conversation to understand this is not simply a matter of him escorting you to a difficult ceremony out of kindness." Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, though she resisted the urge to look away. "Whatever is happening between Kale and myself is still very new," she said carefully. "I'd rather not have it become the subject of pack gossip before either of us has had time to understand it ourselves." "That's precisely why I'm here," Margaret said. "Because whatever this becomes, Elena, it will not remain private for long. The Alpha King of the Northern Coalition does not walk into a modest pack's mating ceremony, publicly challenge one of its rising members, and declare his intention to know a rejected mate better, without that story spreading across every territory within a week. You need to understand what you're stepping into, whether or not you and Kale have fully decided what this relationship will become." Elena absorbed the words carefully, understanding the truth in them even as part of her wished she could simply enjoy the fragile new possibility with Kale, without the immediate weight of political consequence pressing down on it. "What exactly are you trying to tell me?" Margaret's expression softened slightly, though her voice remained firm. "I am telling you that if the Alpha King's interest in you is genuine, and I believe from what I witnessed tonight that it is, you will very quickly become someone of significant importance, across territories, far larger than Ironwood. Packs that never gave you a second thought before tonight will begin paying very close attention to your every move. Some will see opportunity in aligning themselves with you. Others may see you as a threat to be undermined before your position grows too strong to challenge." The weight of the warning settled heavily over Elena, and she found herself thinking back to the 2 years she had spent quietly rebuilding an ordinary life, free from the scrutiny that had once made every day in Ironwood feel like walking through a room full of watching eyes. The idea of stepping into scrutiny, far greater than anything she had previously experienced, scrutiny that extended across an entire region rather than a single pack, was both dizzying and, in an unexpected way, clarifying.
"I appreciate you telling me this," Elena said finally.
"But I need you to understand something as well. I'm not interested in Kale because of his position, and I have no intention of letting his title change who I am. or how I choose to move through the world. If people want to see opportunity or threat in me, that says far more about them than it does about anything I've actually done." Margaret studied her for a long moment, something like approval settling into her sharp features. "That," she said, "is precisely the answer I was hoping to hear. Ironwood made a grave mistake 2 years ago, Elena, allowing Callum's cruelty toward you to go unchallenged, simply because your family's reputation had fallen out of favor. I did not speak against it at the time, and that failure has weighed on me more than I've admitted to anyone. If tonight's events mean you now stand in a position to reshape how this pack, and perhaps others, treat those who have been unfairly cast aside, I would consider that a form of justice long overdue." The admission surprised Elena, coming from a woman she had always associated with rigid adherence to tradition, rather than any willingness to question the pack's past decisions. She found herself studying Margaret with new appreciation, understanding that even within the structures that had once caused her so much pain, there existed people capable of recognizing when those structures had failed. "What do you think I should do?" Elena asked, genuinely uncertain how to navigate the path unfolding before her. Margaret considered the question carefully before answering. "I think you should proceed exactly as you already intended, cautiously, and on your own terms, without allowing anyone's expectations, mine included, to rush you into decisions you're not ready to make. But I also think you should prepare yourself for the reality that privacy, at least the kind you've enjoyed these past 2 years, may no longer be fully available to you. Whatever happens next between you and the Alpha King, the Pack Council will need to address the manner of your original rejection formally, particularly now that the matter has drawn attention from outside our territory." Elena had not considered that possibility, that her old wound might now require the kind of formal acknowledgement the Pack had never previously offered her. What would that mean, practically? "It would mean," Margaret said, "that the Council may need to formally recognize the harm done to you 2 years ago, potentially even offer some form of restitution for the standing you lost within the Pack as a result. It is not something we have done often, but it is not without precedent, particularly in cases where a rejection was handled as poorly and publicly as yours was. The idea of formal acknowledgement, of the Pack finally recognizing what had been done to her, rather than simply allowing it to fade quietly into old gossip, stirred something complicated in Elena's chest. Part of her wanted nothing more than validation long denied, some official recognition that the humiliation she endured had never been deserved. Another part of her, more cautious, worried that such recognition would only tie her more tightly to a Pack and a history she had spent 2 years trying to move beyond. "I'll need time to think about that," she said honestly. "Of course," Margaret replied, rising from the chair, with the same careful deliberation she had used to sit. "There is no urgency tonight. But I wanted you to understand the landscape you're now standing in, before decisions are made around you rather than by you." She paused at the door, turning back with an expression that carried something close to warmth. "For what it's worth, Elena, I am glad you came tonight. Whatever discomfort this evening caused, I believe it has opened a door that should have opened long ago." After Margaret departed, Elena sat alone in the quiet guest room for a long while, turning over everything she had just learned. The evening had already reshaped so much of what she understood about her place in the world, and now, apparently, it stood to reshape even more, extending consequences she had never anticipated when she opened Callum's mocking invitation only days earlier. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts once more, and she opened the door to find Cale standing in the hallway, having clearly just returned from wherever Pack business had occupied him following the ceremony's conclusion. "I wanted to check on you before the night ended," he said. "Margaret mentioned she planned to speak with you. I hope the conversation wasn't too overwhelming." Elena managed a tired smile, stepping back to let him inside. "Overwhelming might be an understatement," she admitted. "Apparently our arrival tonight has consequences neither of us fully considered." Cale listened carefully as she recounted the conversation, his expression growing thoughtful as she described Margaret's warnings about scrutiny and political attention, about the possibility of formal recognition from the Pack Council regarding her original rejection. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, considering his response with evident care. "I should have anticipated this more clearly, before we walked into that hall together," he said finally. "I was focused on making sure you didn't face tonight alone, and I didn't fully weigh the broader consequences that my presence would set in motion. If that complicates your life more than you're prepared for, I understand completely. If you'd rather step back from whatever this is becoming. Elena studied him carefully, appreciating the genuine concern behind the offer, even as she found herself shaking her head. I don't want to step back, she said. I'm not afraid of complications, Cale. I spent 2 years letting fear of complication keep me small and quiet, and out of sight. I'm tired of living that way. Whatever comes from tonight, I'd rather face it than run from it. Something in Cale's expression shifted, a warmth entering his eyes that made Elena's pulse quicken, despite the exhaustion settling over her after such a long and eventful evening. Then we'll face it together, he said simply, for as long as that's what you want. They talked a while longer, working through some of the practical questions Margaret's warnings had raised, before Cale finally excused himself for the night, leaving Elena alone once more with her thoughts. As she prepared for sleep, the strange, unpredictable path of the past several days settling over her like a weight both heavy and strangely comforting, she found herself thinking not of Callum, or the humiliation she had once believed defined her entire future in this pack, but of the quiet strength she had discovered in herself somewhere along a dark and empty road, strength that had carried her through a night she once feared more than almost anything else, and left her standing taller than she had in years. Morning arrived with a knock far more urgent than Margaret's had been the night before, and Elena woke to find one of the pack's younger messengers standing anxiously outside her door, explaining that the council had called an emergency session and requested her presence within the hour. Elena dressed quickly, her mind racing through possibilities as she made her way toward the small meeting chamber, where Ironwood's most important decisions had always been made. She found Cale already waiting outside the chamber doors, his expression unreadable though his posture carried the same steady calm she had come to rely on over the past few days. Any idea what this is about? She asked as she approached. Some, he admitted. Margaret sent word early this morning. It seems your conversation with her last night prompted more discussion among the council than either of us anticipated. Before Elena could ask further questions, the chamber doors opened, and Margaret herself appeared, gesturing them both inside with an expression that gave little away. The chamber was smaller than the grand hall where the previous night's ceremony had taken place, arranged with a long table where the pack's 5 elders sat in careful formation, each of them watching Elena and Cale enter, with expressions ranging from cautious curiosity to open skepticism. To Elena's surprise, Callum stood near the far wall as well, arms crossed, his expression carrying a mixture of resentment and unease that suggested he had been summoned here against his preference rather than by choice. Priya stood beside him, though she kept a careful distance, as though already anticipating that whatever happened in this room might not favor her new mate. Thank you both for coming on short notice, Margaret said, taking her seat at the head of the table. Last night's events raised questions this council can no longer avoid addressing, questions that touch not only on matters of pack honor, but on Ironwood's standing among neighboring territories. One of the other elders, a stern-faced man Elena did not recognize, leaned forward slightly. Let us speak plainly. 2 years ago, this council allowed a fated rejection to occur, without proper intervention, despite clear evidence that the rejection was motivated by concerns over family reputation, rather than any genuine incompatibility between mates. We have carried that failure quietly, hoping it would fade from relevance over time. Last night made clear that hope was misplaced. Callum shifted uncomfortably against the wall, opening his mouth as if to object, though Margaret's sharp glance silenced whatever protest he had been forming. Callum, she said, you will have opportunity to speak, but I would ask you to listen first. The elder continued, his gaze moving toward Elena with an expression that carried something close to apology, rare enough from pack leadership that Elena felt herself tense with surprise. Elena Voss, on behalf of this council, we wish to formally acknowledge that the treatment you received 2 years ago fell far short of what any member of this pack deserves, regardless of family history or standing. The public nature of your rejection, orchestrated deliberately to maximize your humiliation, was a failure this council should have addressed immediately, rather than allowing to stand unchallenged. Elena felt the weight of the words settle over her, unexpected tears pricking at the corners of her eyes, despite her determination to remain composed. 2 years of quiet, unacknowledged pain suddenly found itself met with formal recognition she had never truly believed would come, and the relief of finally hearing it spoken aloud proved more powerful than she anticipated. Furthermore, the elder continued, Given the circumstances that have since unfolded, including the clear regard shown toward you by Alpha King Draven, this council believes it appropriate to formally restore your standing within Ironwood, including reinstating any privileges and status lost as a result of the original rejection, should you choose to accept that restoration. Callum finally found his voice, stepping forward with visible agitation. This is absurd. You're rewriting history because a powerful outsider showed up and made a scene. What happened between Elena and myself was a private matter, and the council had no issue with it at the time. The council, Margaret said sharply, cutting through his protest with practiced authority, made an error in judgment 2 years ago that we are only now finding the courage to correct. Your cruelty toward Elena was never acceptable, Callum, regardless of whether the Alpha King's presence last night forced us to finally acknowledge it. That you require outside pressure to see the wrongness of your own actions speaks poorly of your character, not of this council's decision to correct its mistake. The chamber fell silent, Callum's face reddening as the weight of the elders' collective disapproval settled over him, more heavily than anything Elena's own words the previous night had managed to achieve. Priya, standing beside him, had grown visibly uncomfortable, her earlier confidence entirely absent as she seemed to recalculate exactly what kind of mate she had bound herself to only hours earlier. Kale, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke, his voice measured but carrying unmistakable weight. I appreciate the council's willingness to address this matter directly, he said. I did not come to Ironwood intending to reshape internal pact decisions, and I want to be clear that whatever recognition Elena receives today should be understood as this council's own choice, made because it was right, not because of any pressure I applied. Margaret nodded, appreciating the distinction. Understood, and appreciated. Though I will say, Alpha King, your presence last night did serve as a valuable reminder that the consequences of cruelty do not always remain contained within the borders where they occur. Elena, still processing the magnitude of what was unfolding around her, finally found her voice. I want to thank the council for this acknowledgement, she said carefully. It means more than I can easily express. But I also need to be honest. I've spent 2 years building a life outside Ironwood, and while I appreciate the offer to restore my standing here, I'm not certain I want to return to a pact that only chose to see my worth once someone powerful enough forced the issue. The words landed with visible impact around the table, several elders exchanging uncertain glances at the unexpected pushback. Margaret, however, seemed unsurprised, studying Elena with something like respect. That is entirely your choice to make, she said. The offer of restoration stands regardless of whether you choose to exercise it immediately or ever. What matters most is that Ironwood's official record now reflects the truth of what happened to you, rather than the version that allowed Callum's cruelty to go unquestioned. Elena nodded slowly, grateful for the clarity, though her mind was already turning toward the future, rather than dwelling further on grievances 2 years settled. She glanced toward Kale, finding steady support in his expression, and felt a growing sense that whatever came next in her life would be built on foundations far more solid than anything Ironwood had once offered her. The meeting concluded shortly after, the council formally documenting Elena's restored standing, while leaving the choice of whether to exercise it entirely in her hands. As the elders filed out of the chamber, Callum lingered, clearly wanting to speak, though the words seemed to catch somewhere in his throat, as Elena regarded him with calm, unhurried patience, rather than the anger he perhaps expected. For what it's worth, he finally managed, I am sorry. Not because the council forced this conversation, but because watching you stand in that hall last night, and again in this chamber today, made me realize how small my own choices were 2 years ago. I let fear of what others might think shape a decision that hurt someone who never deserved it. Elena studied him for a long moment, searching for any trace of the performative cruelty she had grown accustomed to expecting from him, and found instead something that seemed, for the first time, genuinely humble. Thank you for saying that, she said quietly. I hope you find the courage to make better choices going forward, for Priya's sake if nothing else. Callum nodded, something like understanding passing between them before he turned and left the chamber, Priya following closely behind, her expression carrying the weight of a woman beginning to understand that the man she had bound herself to still had considerable growing left to do. Alone in the chamber with Kale, Elena finally allowed herself to exhale fully, the accumulated tension of the morning draining slowly from her shoulders. I did not expect any of that, she admitted. Neither did I, Cale said honestly. Though I can't say I'm sorry it happened. You deserve to hear those words, Elena, regardless of what prompted the council to finally speak them. Elena managed a genuine smile, the first fully unguarded one she had offered since arriving back in Ironwood. What happens now? She asked, the question carrying far less anxiety than it had the previous evening. Cale considered the question thoughtfully before answering. Now, he said, I think we take some time to figure out what we want, away from council chambers and mating ceremonies and everything else that's happened over the past 2 days. I'd like the chance to know you without an audience watching, if you're willing. Elena found herself nodding readily, a lightness settling over her that felt unfamiliar after 2 years spent bracing constantly against further disappointment. I think I'd like that too, she said, and for the first time since opening Callum's cruel invitation, days earlier, the future ahead of her felt less like something to survive, and more like something worth genuinely looking forward to. 3 weeks passed before Elena and Cale found themselves back in a formal setting together, though this time the circumstances carried none of the tension that had marked their first public appearance side by side. Cale had invited Elena to his own territory, a sprawling expanse of forested hills and well-organized settlements, far larger than anything Ironwood could claim, and Elena had accepted, curious to see the place that shaped the man who had so unexpectedly reshaped her own understanding of what her future might hold. The Northern Coalition's main settlement sat nestled between 2 mountain ranges, its central lodge built from timber and stone, in a style that felt both grand and remarkably welcoming. Nothing like the cold formality Elena had half expected from a territory of such significant power. Cale met her personally at the border rather than sending an escort, greeting her with a warmth that had grown steadily more comfortable between them over the weeks of careful, unhurried conversation they had maintained since Ironwood. You seem nervous, Cale observed as they walked together toward the main lodge, Elena's overnight bag slung over her shoulder despite his earlier offer to carry it for her. A little, she admitted. It's one thing meeting you on an empty road, or standing beside you in a hall full of people who already knew my whole history. It's another thing entirely, walking into your home territory, meeting people who have no context for who I am, beyond whatever assumptions they've already made. Cale's expression softened with understanding. For what it's worth, most of my pack already knows a fair amount about you. I may have mentioned you once or twice since returning from Ironwood. Elena raised an eyebrow, amused despite her lingering nerves. Once or twice? More than once or twice, he admitted, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. There may have been some curiosity among my closest advisors about the woman who managed to hold her ground against an entire pack's worth of scrutiny, without so much as flinching. The observation warmed something in Elena's chest, and she found her nervousness easing slightly as they continued toward the lodge, passing settlements where pack members went about ordinary daily tasks, several offering polite nods of acknowledgement as Cale passed, their attention lingering curiously on Elena beside him, without any of the hostile scrutiny she had grown accustomed to expecting. Inside the lodge, Cale introduced her to several of his closest advisors, including a sharp-witted woman named Charlotte who served as his second-in-command, and a quieter, thoughtful man named Nathaniel, who oversaw the territory's relations with neighboring packs. Both greeted Elena with genuine warmth rather than the calculated politeness she had braced herself for, and by the time evening settled over the lodge, Elena found herself relaxing into conversation with an ease that surprised her. They like you, Cale observed later, as the two of them stepped out onto a wide balcony overlooking the settlement below, the evening air cool, and carrying the scent of pine from the surrounding hills. I like them too, Elena admitted. This place feels different than I expected, less rigid than Ironwood, somehow, despite your position carrying so much more weight. Cale considered her observation thoughtfully. I've spent 6 years trying to build something different from the territories I grew up watching, he said. Places where power was hoarded and status determined everything about how people treated each other, much like what you experienced in Ironwood. I wanted my own territory to function differently. Strength should protect people, not be used to diminish them. Elena studied him in the soft evening light, appreciating the conviction behind his words, understanding more clearly with each passing week why his presence had felt so immediately different from anyone she had previously encountered. Is that why you stepped in that night at the ceremony? She asked. Because you couldn't stand watching someone use their position to diminish another person? Partly, Cale admitted, though if I'm being honest, my reasons that night were far less philosophical than that. I saw someone I had already come to care for, standing in a room full of people determined to make her feel small, and I found I could not simply stand by and let that happen, regardless of the political complications it might create. The admission settled warmly over Elena, and she found herself moving closer to him, without conscious decision, drawn by the steady honesty he had offered her since the very beginning of their unexpected connection. "I'm glad you didn't stand by," she said quietly. Cale turned toward her fully, his expression carrying a tenderness that made Elena's pulse quicken pleasantly. "I meant what I said that night," he said, "about wanting to know you better, about not being interested in walking away from whatever this is, simply because it started in more complicated circumstances than either of us expected. 3 weeks of careful conversation have only made me more certain of that, Elena." Elena felt her heart swell with something she had not allowed herself to fully name until this moment, standing beside him on a quiet balcony, overlooking the territory he had built with such deliberate care. "I feel the same way," she said honestly. "I spent so long after Callum's rejection, convinced that trusting someone again would only lead to more pain. But these past few weeks, with you, have made me start to believe that maybe not every connection has to end that way." Cale reached out, gently tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, the gesture careful and unhurried, despite the obvious warmth building between them. "I don't intend to give you any reason to doubt that belief," he said softly. "You deserve someone who sees your worth clearly, without conditions or hesitation. I intend to be that person, for as long as you'll allow it." The words settled deeply over Elena, and she found herself smiling in a way that felt entirely unguarded, free from the careful caution she had maintained through so many difficult months of rebuilding her life from nothing. "I think I'd like to see just how far that intention carries us," she said. They stood together on the balcony a while longer, conversation drifting easily between lighter subjects, stories from Cale's years building the Northern Coalition, memories Elena shared from her own childhood, before everything with Callum had reshaped her understanding of her place in the world. The evening passed comfortably, free from the political weight that had colored their first public appearance together, allowing them both the space to simply enjoy each other's company, without complication. Later, as Elena prepared for sleep in the comfortable guest quarters Cale had arranged for her within the lodge, she found herself reflecting on how dramatically her circumstances had shifted in the span of a single month. She had arrived at Callum's mating ceremony, bracing herself for humiliation, determined only to prove she could survive one final difficult night in Ironwood before returning to her quiet, ordinary life. Instead, she had found herself standing at the beginning of something far larger and more meaningful than she could have anticipated, a connection built not on rescue or pity, but on genuine mutual respect and growing affection that felt steadier with each passing day. She thought, too, of the formal acknowledgement the Ironwood Council had offered her, the restored standing she had not yet decided whether to exercise, and understood with growing clarity that her future no longer depended on any single pack's approval or recognition. Whatever came next, whether she chose to reclaim her place in Ironwood or build an entirely new life within the Northern Coalition, or somewhere else entirely, she would make that choice from a position of genuine strength rather than desperate necessity. As sleep finally began to claim her, Elena found herself thinking of the empty road where this unexpected chapter of her life had begun, the dark trees and the rogue wolf's growl, and the steady, unassuming stranger who had emerged from the shadows to save her without any expectation of reward. She had not known, in that frightening moment, how completely her life was about to change. She only knew, now, lying comfortable and safe within the walls of a territory built on the values she had once believed impossible to find, that she was deeply grateful the encounter had happened exactly as it did. Tomorrow would bring new conversations, new questions about what their future together might look like, new challenges as word of their connection continued spreading across territories, eager to understand what it meant for the balance of power in the region. But tonight, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, Elena Voss fell asleep, feeling entirely, unshakably certain that whatever came next, she would not be facing it alone. The peace of those quiet weeks did not last uninterrupted. Nearly a month after Elena's visit to the Northern Coalition, Charlotte arrived at the lodge one afternoon, with news that immediately darkened the easy atmosphere Elena had grown accustomed to during her extended stay. She found Cale in his study, a converted room lined with maps of the surrounding territories, and the tension in Charlotte's posture was enough to make Elena set aside the book she had been reading nearby. "We've had reports of increased rogue activity along the southern border," Charlotte said without preamble. "3 attacks in the past week alone, all coordinated in a way that doesn't match typical rogue behavior. Isolated wolves don't usually organize like this." Cale's expression sharpened immediately, the relaxed warmth Elena had grown used to seeing in him, replaced by the focused intensity she remembered from their very first encounter on the dark and empty road. "Coordinated how?" he asked. "Timed strikes, multiple locations within hours of each other, always targeting patrol routes rather than settlements," Charlotte explained. "It has the signature of deliberate strategy, not random opportunism." Elena felt a chill settle over her, memory of the rogue wolf that had nearly attacked her on that same southern stretch of road rising unbidden in her mind. "Do you think this connects to what happened to me?" she asked, the question drawing both Cale and Charlotte's attention toward her. Cale considered the possibility carefully. "It's worth investigating," he said. "Rogue wolves acting alone rarely target well-traveled roads so close to coalition territory. If someone deliberately sent that wolf toward you, it's possible the same coordination is now testing our southern defenses more broadly." The idea that her encounter on the road, the very incident that had brought Cale into her life, might have been something other than random chance, settled uneasily over Elena. "Who would want to target me specifically?" she asked. "I wasn't anyone significant before that night. I was just a woman driving alone, toward a ceremony no one outside Ironwood particularly cared about." "That may be exactly the point," Cale said grimly. "If someone wanted to weaken Ironwood's standing, or create instability that could be exploited later, targeting an isolated traveler with connections to the Pact's recent controversy would be a subtle way to begin. Whether they anticipated my involvement is a separate question entirely." Charlotte nodded slowly, her sharp mind clearly working through the implications. "There's another possibility worth considering," she said carefully. "Territories bordering the coalition have not universally welcomed your growing influence, Cale. Some may see recent events, your public involvement with Elena, the political embarrassment caused to Ironwood's rising beta, as an opportunity to test whether your attention has become divided enough to create vulnerability." The suggestion hung heavily in the room, and Elena felt a familiar knot of guilt forming in her chest, the fear that her presence in Cale's life might be creating complications and dangers he would not otherwise face. Cale, seeming to sense her reaction, reached over and took her hand firmly in his. "Whatever is happening along that border has nothing to do with any failure on your part," he said, his voice steady and certain. "If someone believes targeting instability near you creates opportunity, that is a reflection of their own calculations, not evidence that you've brought danger into this territory. I would face challenges to coalition security, regardless of whether you were part of my life or not." Elena appreciated the reassurance, though the underlying tension remained. "What do you need to do?" she asked. "I need to travel to the southern border personally, assess the situation directly, and coordinate with local patrol leaders on a stronger response," Cale said, already rising from his desk with the decisive energy of someone accustomed to acting quickly once a threat had been identified. "Charlotte, I want increased patrols along every route, connecting to Ironwood territory as well, in case this extends beyond our own borders." Charlotte nodded and departed to begin coordinating the response, leaving Elena alone with Cale as he gathered supplies for the journey ahead. She watched him move with quiet efficiency, the calm authority she had first witnessed on that dark road, now fully visible in every practiced motion, and found herself torn between admiration for his capability and worry over what this growing threat might ultimately mean. "I want to come with you," she said finally, the words surprising even herself as she spoke them. Cale paused, studying her carefully. "This isn't a diplomatic visit, Elena. If these attacks are coordinated the way Charlotte described, the southern border could be genuinely dangerous." "I understand that," Elena said, holding his gaze steadily. "But if this threat connects back to what happened to me on that road, I'd rather understand it directly than wait here, wondering what's happening, while people I care about face danger on my behalf. I'm not asking to be reckless. I'm asking not to be shielded from something that may very well involve me whether I'm present or not. Kale considered her request for a long moment, weighing the very real risks against the determination he clearly recognized in her expression, the same steady resolve that had carried her through Callum's mocking invitation and the tense confrontation in Ironwood's ceremony hall. Finally he nodded, though his expression remained serious. "You'll stay close to me at all times," he said. "And if I determine the situation has grown too dangerous, you'll retreat to safety immediately, without argument. Agreed?" "Agreed," Elena said, relief washing through her at not being left behind to wait anxiously for news. They departed within the hour, traveling south with a small escort of Kale's most trusted guards, the journey carrying none of the relaxed ease that had marked their earlier travels together. Elena watched the landscape shift as they approached the border region, dense forest giving way to more rugged terrain, where visibility narrowed considerably, and the tension among their escort grew palpable with every passing mile. They arrived at a small outpost near the southern border as evening settled over the hills, greeted by a weary patrol leader named Edward, who quickly briefed Kale on the latest developments. 2 more attacks had occurred since Charlotte's initial report, both showing the same coordinated pattern, and Edward's team had managed to capture one of the rogue wolves involved, though the creature had refused to speak, its eyes carrying a wildness that suggested something beyond simple desperation driving its actions. "There's something else," Edward said carefully, glancing toward Elena before continuing. "One of my scouts recognized a scent near the site of the first attack, the same location where the rogue nearly reached the traveler your escort saved several weeks ago. It matches a pattern we've seen before, associated with a group operating out of contested territory near the eastern ridge." Kale's expression darkened considerably. "The Ridgeback faction," he said, the name carrying weight that made Edward nod grimly in confirmation. "What is the Ridgeback faction?" Elena asked, though something in the tense silence that followed the name told her the answer would not be reassuring. Kale turned toward her, his jaw set with barely contained frustration. "A group of rogue wolves who once served under a territory I dismantled 3 years ago, after their leadership grew violent and unstable enough to threaten neighboring settlements. I believed we had scattered them permanently, but if they're organizing again, and if they deliberately targeted you specifically as a way to draw attention or create instability, this is far more serious than a simple border skirmish." Elena felt the weight of the revelation settle heavily over her, understanding now that the danger she had narrowly escaped on that dark road weeks earlier might have been no accident at all, but the opening move in something far larger and more calculated than she had ever imagined. The quiet, hopeful chapter of her life she had begun building with Kale suddenly felt far more precarious than the peaceful weeks at the lodge had allowed her to believe, and as night fully descended over the tense outpost, Elena understood that whatever came next would test both her courage and her growing bond with Kale in ways neither of them had yet fully prepared for. Sleep came fitfully that night at the border outpost, Elena lying awake in the small room assigned to her, mind racing through the implications of everything Edward had revealed. She rose before dawn, drawn by the sound of low voices from the main gathering room, and found Kale already awake, hunched over a map spread across a wooden table, with Edward and several other patrol leaders, their expressions grim in the lamplight. "The scouting reports came in overnight," Kale said, glancing up as she entered. "The Ridgeback faction has established a camp roughly 2 hours from here, larger than we initially estimated. It seems they've spent the past 3 years quietly rebuilding rather than scattering as we believed." "What's their goal?" Elena asked, moving closer to study the map alongside them. "Based on the pattern of attacks, we believe they're testing our response capabilities, while working to identify weaknesses along the border," Edward explained. "The coordinated timing suggests they have a competent leader directing strategy, someone patient enough to rebuild slowly, rather than striking prematurely." Kale's finger traced a line along the map, indicating the camp's estimated position relative to the outpost. "If we move quickly and decisively, we can address this before it grows into something requiring a much larger response. I intend to lead a delegation to the camp directly, offer terms for peaceful resolution, before considering more forceful options." Elena felt her stomach tighten at the implication. "You're going to negotiate with them directly?" "It's often the most effective approach," Kale said. though his expression carried the weight of someone who understood the risks involved. The Ridgeback faction's previous leadership was violent and unstable, but if this new organization is patient enough to rebuild carefully over 3 years, there may be room for a solution that doesn't require conflict extending across the entire border region. The plan carried obvious danger, and Elena found herself wanting desperately to accompany him despite understanding, more clearly than during their journey south, exactly how serious the stakes had become. Cale, seeming to anticipate her request before she could voice it, met her gaze directly. "I need you to remain here at the outpost," he said gently but firmly. "Not because I doubt your courage, Elena, but because if this faction targeted you specifically as part of their strategy, walking directly into their camp would give them exactly the leverage they might be hoping for." The logic settled over her reluctantly, and though every instinct urged her to argue, she recognized the wisdom in his caution. "Promise me you'll be careful," she said instead, the words carrying weight beyond simple courtesy. "I promise," Cale said, reaching out to gently cup her face in his hand, the gesture tender, despite the tension of the moment. "I have far too much waiting for me here to take unnecessary risks." The morning passed, with agonizing slowness, after Cale departed, with a carefully selected delegation, Elena pacing the small confines of the outpost, while Edward and the remaining guards maintained careful watch along the perimeter. She tried to occupy herself with small tasks, helping organize supplies, checking on the well-being of the outpost's smaller staff, anything to keep her mind from spiraling into worry over what might be unfolding at the Ridgeback camp. It was well past midday when a scout came racing back toward the outpost, breathless and urgent, delivering news that sent a fresh wave of alarm through the assembled guards. The negotiation had not gone as smoothly as hoped. The Ridgeback faction's leader, a wolf named Victor, who had apparently emerged from the previous leadership's collapse to build his own following, had grown hostile upon learning of Cale's connection to Elena, revealing that their earlier strategy had indeed been deliberately aimed at destabilizing both Ironwood and the coalition by targeting her specifically weeks earlier. "He wants a direct confrontation," the scout reported, still catching his breath. "He's demanding Elena be brought to the camp personally, claiming he has grievances against the coalition that predate the border disputes. Something about territory his previous leadership lost when Cale dismantled their operation 3 years ago." Elena felt cold dread settle through her chest, understanding immediately the impossible position this demand created. "Is Cale safe?" she asked urgently. "For now," the scout confirmed. "Victor has agreed to a temporary truce while awaiting a response, but he's made clear the situation will deteriorate quickly if his demand isn't addressed." Edward's expression had grown grave, clearly weighing the dangerous calculus of the situation. "We cannot send Elena into that camp," he said firmly. "Whatever grievance this Victor holds, using her as a bargaining chip is exactly the kind of leverage we cannot afford to grant him." Elena, however, found her mind working through the situation with a clarity that surprised her, the same steady resolve that had carried her through Callum's cruel invitation, now settling over her with renewed purpose. "I don't think refusing outright is the right approach," she said carefully. "If Victor's grievance predates my involvement entirely, connected instead to territory lost 3 years ago, then perhaps what he actually wants isn't me specifically, but acknowledgement, the same kind of acknowledgement Ironwood's council eventually offered me. Sending an outright refusal might only convince him further that violence is the only path left available to him." Edward looked skeptical, though he did not immediately dismiss her reasoning. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting I go to the border, not into the camp itself, but close enough for a supervised meeting, under terms that protect everyone involved," Elena said. "If Victor genuinely wants dialogue rather than simple destruction, meeting him partway, with proper precautions in place, might resolve this without further conflict. If he refuses reasonable terms, that tells us clearly enough what kind of response will ultimately be necessary." The plan carried obvious risk, and Edward remained visibly reluctant, but after careful discussion and the arrangement of significant additional security measures, including experienced guards, positioned strategically along the proposed meeting point, he agreed to relay the offer back to Cale's delegation for consideration. Cale's response arrived within the hour, carrying clear reluctance but ultimately acknowledging the strategic wisdom in Elena's proposal, provided every possible precaution remained firmly in place. Elena traveled toward the agreed meeting point that afternoon, flanked by a substantial guard, her heart pounding steadily as the dense forest gave way to a clearing where Cale's delegation already waited, tension visible in every posture among the gathered guards. Victor emerged from the tree line opposite them, a broad-shouldered man with weathered features and eyes that carried more exhaustion than the malice Elena had braced herself to encounter. He studied her carefully across the clearing, some of the aggressive posturing Cale's scout had described, seeming to fade slightly as he took in her steady, unflinching presence. "You came," he said finally, his voice rougher than expected. "I expected the Alpha King to refuse my demand entirely." "He nearly did," Elena said honestly, holding her ground despite every instinct urging caution. "I asked to come instead because I wanted to understand what actually happened 3 years ago, before deciding whether this conflict truly needs to continue." Victor's expression shifted, surprise flickering across his weathered features at her directness. Over the following tense but careful conversation, held under Cale's watchful attention and the readiness of guards on both sides, Elena learned the fuller history behind the Ridgeback faction's grievance: territory unfairly seized during the previous leadership's collapse, families displaced without adequate consideration, resentment that had festered for 3 years, without any formal acknowledgement or resolution offered by the coalition. By the time the sun began sinking toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the clearing, a fragile but genuine framework for resolution had begun taking shape, one that involved formal negotiations over the disputed territory, acknowledgement of grievances that had gone unaddressed for far too long, and a path forward that did not require further violence to achieve. Victor, though still guarded, seemed genuinely surprised by the willingness shown toward addressing decades-old wounds, rather than simply meeting force with greater force. As the meeting concluded and both delegations began withdrawing cautiously from the clearing, Cale moved quickly to Elena's side, relief evident in every line of his expression, despite the careful composure he had maintained throughout the tense negotiation. "That was either remarkably brave or remarkably reckless," he said quietly, though warmth softened the words considerably. "Maybe a little of both," Elena admitted, allowing herself finally to exhale the tension she had carried throughout the entire encounter. "But I understood something out there, Cale. Victor wasn't looking for a fight so much as he was looking for someone willing to actually listen to what happened to his people. I recognized that need, because it wasn't so different from what I needed from Ironwood, after everything Callum put me through." Cale studied her with unmistakable admiration, reaching out to pull her gently into an embrace that carried both relief and deep respect. "You continue to surprise me," he said softly. "Every time I think I understand the full measure of your strength, you find another way to demonstrate exactly how much more there is." As they made their way back toward the outpost together, the immediate danger resolved, though careful negotiations still lay ahead to fully settle the Ridgeback faction's grievances. Elena felt a profound sense of accomplishment settling over her, distinct from anything she had experienced even during the confrontation at Callum's ceremony weeks earlier. She had faced genuine danger not by hiding behind Cale's power, but by drawing on her own hard-won understanding of what it meant to be dismissed and unheard, and had used that understanding to help forge the beginning of genuine peace, rather than deeper conflict. 6 months passed following the tense negotiation in that quiet forest clearing, months that carried both the steady work of formalizing peace with the Ridgeback faction and the gradual deepening of everything building between Elena and Cale. The disputed territory negotiations concluded successfully within weeks, Victor's people receiving fair acknowledgement and resolution that transformed what had once been simmering resentment into cautious but genuine cooperation with the coalition. Elena often thought back to that clearing, understanding now more fully than ever how closely her own story of dismissal and eventual recognition had mirrored the larger conflict she helped resolve. Word of everything that had unfolded, from the confrontation at Callum's mating ceremony through the successful resolution of the border conflict, spread steadily across the region, and Elena found herself, somewhat to her continued surprise, regarded increasingly as a figure of genuine respect rather than simply the woman connected to a powerful Alpha King. Pacts that had once dismissed her, including Ironwood itself, now extended invitations and correspondence carrying real deference, eager to maintain good standing with someone whose judgment had proven both wise and effective under significant pressure. Ironwood's formal acknowledgement of her restored standing had never expired, and Elena had eventually chosen to accept limited reinstatement, not because she intended to return permanently to the pack that had once cast her aside, but because she wanted the choice to remain fully hers, rather than something denied to her by circumstances beyond her control. Margaret had written to her regularly since that tense meeting in the council chamber, the older woman's letters carrying genuine warmth and updates on pack matters that Elena found herself appreciating more than she expected. Callum, for his part, had apparently taken the humbling lessons of that difficult night to heart in the months since. Reports reaching Elena through Margaret's correspondence suggested he had grown noticeably more thoughtful in his leadership within Ironwood, less concerned with appearances, and more attentive to the well-being of those under his care, a transformation Elena chose to view with cautious optimism rather than lingering resentment. Priya, too, seemed to have settled into her role with growing confidence, and Elena occasionally allowed herself to hope that both of them had found, in the aftermath of that painful public reckoning, a stronger foundation than the one built on appearances that had originally brought them together. For Elena herself, the past 6 months had brought changes far more personal and meaningful than shifting political fortunes. She had taken on a growing role within the Northern Coalition, working alongside Charlotte and Nathaniel to help formalize processes for addressing exactly the kind of grievances that had once nearly reignited violent conflict along the southern border, drawing on her own experience of dismissal and eventual acknowledgement to help build systems that gave voice to those who might otherwise go unheard. The work suited her in ways she had never anticipated during her quiet years living in isolated obscurity following Callum's rejection, and she found genuine purpose in helping shape a territory built on the values Cale had described to her that first evening on his balcony, overlooking the settlement below. Her relationship with Cale had deepened steadily throughout those months as well, built on the same patient, unhurried foundation they had established from the very beginning. There had been no rush toward formal commitment, no pressure applied by either of them despite the political weight that continued to surround their connection, only the steady accumulation of trust and genuine affection that Elena had once believed impossible to find again, after the devastating rejection that had reshaped her entire understanding of what she deserved. It was on a quiet evening in early autumn, nearly a year to the day since that fateful mating ceremony invitation had arrived at her small apartment 3 towns away, that Cale finally raised the subject neither of them had rushed toward, but both had clearly been considering for some time. They sat together on the same balcony where he had first told her, months earlier, that he intended to know her better, regardless of the complications their connection had created. The evening air, carrying the same cool scent of pine that had marked so many of their quiet conversations since. "I've been thinking about something," Cale said, his tone carrying a careful weight that immediately drew Elena's full attention. "About fated bonds, and what they actually mean, beyond simply the mark that appears on skin." Elena studied him carefully, understanding immediately the direction this conversation was heading, her heart quickening, despite the calm she worked to maintain. "What have you been thinking?" "I've led this territory for 7 years now, watching countless fated bonds form among my pack, some strong and lasting, others fragile enough to break under far less pressure than what you and I have already weathered together," Cale continued. "I never carried a fated mark myself before I met you, Elena. I assumed, given my age and position, that perhaps I simply wasn't meant to experience that particular kind of connection." Elena felt her breath catch, understanding building steadily as she listened. "And now?" Cale reached over, gently taking her hand and turning it palm upward, revealing the faint, nearly invisible mark that had begun forming there weeks earlier, one Elena had noticed but chosen not to mention, uncertain what it meant, or whether Cale had experienced anything similar. "Now," he said softly, "I understand that fate sometimes takes its time, waiting until 2 people have proven, through everything except a simple mark, that they belong together, before finally making the connection visible." Elena looked down at her palm, the faint mark catching the evening light, in a way that suddenly felt undeniably significant. "I thought I was imagining it," she admitted. "I didn't want to say anything, in case it meant nothing at all." "It means everything," Cale said, his voice carrying quiet certainty. "I've felt this connection building between us, since that night on the road, Elena, long before any mark appeared to confirm what I already knew in my own heart. But I understand now why some part of me held back from saying so definitively until I saw this mark form, because after everything you experienced with Callum, I wanted you to know beyond any doubt that whatever we build together will never carry even the smallest resemblance to the rejection that once tried to break you." Tears gathered in Elena's eyes, though they carried none of the pain that had once accompanied similar tears during her darkest months following Callum's public humiliation. These tears carried only overwhelming gratitude and joy, the culmination of a journey that had begun with a cruel invitation designed to wound her, and had instead led her toward a life and a love she had once believed entirely beyond her reach. "I love you," she said, the words emerging with a simplicity that felt more powerful than any elaborate declaration could have managed. Not because of the mark, not because of everything we've built together over these months, though all of that matters deeply. I love you because from that very first moment on the road, you saw me as someone worth protecting and respecting, long before you knew anything about titles or territories, or the complicated history that once defined how others saw me. Cale pulled her close, the embrace carrying warmth and certainty that settled every remaining doubt Elena had once carried about whether genuine, lasting love remained possible after everything she had endured. "I love you too," he said softly against her hair, "and I intend to spend as many years as fate allows, proving that every single day." They stood together on that balcony as evening fully settled into night, the settlement below glowing softly with lantern light, the mark on Elena's palm a quiet, undeniable confirmation of everything they had already built together through patience, honesty, and mutual respect, rather than the sudden, unquestioned magic of fate alone. Elena thought back, one final time, to the woman who had stood alone in Callum's ceremony hall a year earlier, bracing herself for humiliation she believed inevitable, and understood with profound gratitude exactly how far that frightened, determined woman had traveled since. She had walked into that hall expecting to prove only that she could survive one final painful night in Ironwood. Instead, she had discovered a strength within herself she never fully recognized before, a strength that had carried her through political upheaval, genuine danger, and the slow, careful work of learning to trust again after devastating betrayal. She had found, in the most unexpected circumstances imaginable, a partner who valued her not despite her difficult history, but because of the resilience and wisdom that history had helped forge within her. The beta who had once invited her to his mating ceremony, hoping only to mock her, had, without ever intending to, set in motion a chain of events that led her directly into the arms of the Alpha King, a connection built on genuine respect and steady, patient love, rather than the fleeting cruelty that had once defined her understanding of her own worth. And as Elena stood beneath the stars that night, safe and cherished beside the man who had chosen her freely and completely, she understood with unshakable certainty that whatever challenges the future still held, she would face them, not as the rejected woman Callum once tried to diminish, but as exactly who she had always been meant to become,